Time for a little breath. A little breath. On the worst day of my life, I got up, I grabbed my Portuguese water dog, Bailey, jumped in my son's black Sequoia truck, and drove into town. We parked by the lake, Lake Ontario. I thought if I kept moving forward, the bad news that was coming to me couldn't find me. We kept walking. We walked by the edge of the lake. I could see the algae. I just stared, and my dog patiently walked beside me, every now and then looking up. We walked around, and we walked in circles for a little while. Finally, I decided to go back to the truck. When I hopped inside, I'd noticed that my husband had called a couple times. The bad news was coming. He called again. I ignored it. But on the second ring, I decided to pick up the phone. The very first words that my husband said were, "Lynn, the news is not good. Where are you? We need to be together." I said, "I don't want to know anymore. I don't want you to find me because it will make it real. We need to be together. We need to go get the girls." When he said the girls, I said, "Yes, this is where I'm at." Later that day, we went to both the girls' schools, picked them up. And walking into that house for the first time after that moment was like walking into a house of pain. The weight of the sadness was visceral. Everybody went to their corners. I walked outside. I needed to breathe in fresh air, and I needed to see the sky, because somehow I know that I had lost my son. I didn't know how at that point, but he had to be around me. He was outside. He was somewhere in nature. So I walked over to a few steps around the garden where I planted the pink hydrangeas, and where Daniel has strategically placed my little statue of Rodin, the thinker. I sat down and cried. And I cried and I cried. And I willed him back. And then Amy quietly walked out and put her arm on my shoulder and said, "Mom, if anybody can, you will make something come of this." In that instant, I knew that my 23-year-old amazing son, Daniel, had taken his life. I also knew in that moment the feelings and the despair that he must have had were so great that he could not see another day. In the moment, I felt no shame, just such a sadness that I, his mother, couldn't save him. We didn't have words for mental illness then, or depression. We didn't talk about those things. And I know that perhaps I lived in denial, because I could see signs, but they really never resonated with me, because he was so full of life and moving towards the future. What I was really afraid of on that first day, I had already lost my son, but was I going to lose his memory? 2 days removed from his suicide, I put my runners on and went for a run. Nowhere in particular, I just started running. My husband very graciously came with me, but I eventually waved him off. I needed to be by myself, because on that first moment when I was running from the pain, that first run was towards the pain and towards the grief, and to recognize what I had lost. And as I ran, I screamed his name. I said, "Daniel, where are you? I miss you. We miss you. Where's the humor?" But interestingly enough, as I cried and I cried and I ran and I almost tripped, I started to see his face again. And I heard his voice in my head, and that made me smile. And I thought about our family and our adventures and our fights and the love that we shared. And I knew that we were no longer that great family of 5, we were 4. But I started to write to him in my head. I started to write him a letter. And the very act of being so self-absorbed and intentionally grieving truly allowed me to get to another place. Because shortly thereafter, I started writing about him, writing in my journal, writing anything I could remember about him. And that really was the part of me digging into the grief that I had run away from on day one. I was running towards it, and I was letting it take over me. Time does heal. Grief remembers. I'm a marathoner. My family is incredibly supportive, and they've been to almost every race. Just ask them. And when I say I'm not doing any more races, they go, yeah, right, whatever. And so that's that. So Daniel and I I'd shared a race, thought of a race with him, something that was a big reach for me. It was a half Ironman, which is a triathlon with a swim, bike, and a run. So he said, Mom, like, are you really going to be able to do that distance? Come on. But he said, at the end of our conversation, he said, yeah, you'll do it. I know you'll do it. The problem was, his life ended in 2009. And for our family, so did many other things. I never did that race. But I had found my son. And in all those years of spending time in deep grief and allowing it to absorb me, allowing me to write about my son, I got to know another side of him. And that really took me to places that I could get to physically. And so in 2015, I started that race. And with my daughter, both my daughters really, and my son and my husband in the crowd, I crossed that finish line with my boy. Thank you.